Today's day is 3 February 2023, and I have the pleasure of interviewing John Freeman here at the Tank Farm in Nokesville, Virginia. So John, thank you very much for sitting down and talking to us.
My pleasure.
Can you just give us a little bit of background on yourself? Where were you born? Where did you grow up, go to school, things like that?
Born into a military family in Charleston, South Carolina. Started off at the Navy hospital, but my dad was in the Air Force.
Okay.
With his career, we moved around as people in military families do. I really started making memories in Germany when we were living over there. Moved back stateside, Scott Air Force Base, Illinois. And then his last assignment was Offutt Air Force Base, which brought us to Nebraska, where I ended up going to junior high, high school, and most of my college career before realizing, this college thing isn't right for me. I'm wasting my grandfather and my parents' money. I think I'll join the Army. So I started talking to the Army recruiter.
Okay.
Took the ASVAB. He said I tested high enough for military intelligence, showed me some of the videos. The video that got my attention was a Jeep driving through a sandy pine forest with what looked like a big box on the back of it, where you think a machine gun would go. Think of a World War II Jeep, but it was a loudspeaker. And I thought, what is that? And he explained it's psychological operations. He probably stumbled over what it was. Didn't register in my mind. And then he said, it's got the airborne option. And I said, what's that? He goes, you'd make an extra $110 a month. And I thought, well, I'll take extra money, sign me up. Had no idea what I was getting into. Went to basic training, just like everybody else. The benefit of going to basic training with the people that I would go through other training with and then ultimately be assigned with, I think was a key factor in why I had such a positive experience in the Army. People that I went to basic training with, I'm still in contact with almost daily. And that was a very long time ago. So basic training, Fort Jackson, South Carolina, then on to our advanced individual training at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and starting to understand what psychological operations was all about. From the Vietnam era, winning the hearts and minds of a populace or the enemy. And so we learned everything about propaganda. We learned how to assess target audiences. We learned how to develop information campaigns, how to disseminate messages, posters, leaflets, all the way down to loudspeakers. And by the time we started doing training, I kind of thought that loudspeakers would be something, that I would probably do well with. And of course, I ended up being assigned to a loudspeaker platoon, at the time called an AV platoon, audio-visual platoon. The community has gone through different acronym changes, so some of mine will be dated from the late 80s, early 90s. And arriving that first day at my platoon, as I'm walking from the battalion building down to where the platoon building was, I saw some guys out on the field getting ready to practice for what would be a jump later on for them that afternoon or that evening. And I thought, man, this is great. Had recently completed jump school, and easy, no problems, fun to jump out of an Air Force jet or a cargo plane and end up landing in Alabama. So back to that first day of the unit, walked into the platoon, and it was a 1940s style shack that I'm sure had been built during World War II and had not been upgraded, and this is now July of 1989, but walked in and saw the guys, the platoon, and met our platoon sergeant and met the guy who would be my team sergeant. And somebody came up to me within a few minutes and said, do you drink beer? I said, well, yeah, of course I do. Good, because Sergeant Coolidge just got promoted today. He's buying beer after final formation. So my introduction to the unit was going to the little tiny club, not too far from where our platoon building was, having beers, ending up back in the barracks. And the next morning, kind of my first full day in the platoon, I don't know where I am. So thankfully, the guys, roommates, the team sergeant must have found me, got me to that first formation. We did a little bit of training in and around Fort Bragg in the fall of '89, but we did deploy to St. Croix after a hurricane for humanitarian relief. We were down there for 3 weeks, which was kind of my baptism with the loudspeaker system, driving a Humvee, trying to get messages to audiences. And this was to American citizens in St. Croix. Hey, here's where the water site will be. Here's where food will be distributed. If you need medical help, come here. But all throughout the fall of 1989, there were echoes and whispers that we were going to be going to Panama. The Noriega regime was still in power. Sister companies, sister battalions of ours were already doing rotations. Some of the guys in the platoon had already been down to Panama for a 3 or 4 month rotation. So I thought, this will be great. When we go, we go. And Panama was more and more in the news, and I didn't know it at the time, but the 18th Airborne Corps was doing practice deployments, practice exercises. A couple of us were probably on a jump that was exercising, how would we move that many people if the order came from above. But we were getting ready for what we thought was going to be, I guess, like a training trip over to Berlin, Germany. Our company commander had been in the Berlin Brigade. Our company, our battalion was EUCOM focused, European Command. So if the then Soviets were going to come across the Fulda Gap, we would go and the Soviets would be our targets for surrender, for whatever. So we were going to go to Berlin, do a site assessment, understand more of the Germans, understand more of the Soviets. And I thought, this is great. I get to go back to Germany. I knew Germany as a kid. This will be great to go back and be able to drink beer. I didn't drink beer when I was in elementary school. So I loved bratwurst. I was fired up to go back to Germany. A Monday, I guess it would have been the 18th of December, in a chow hall, and one of our company clerks came running in and said, guys, come on, you got to come with us. Come on, man, you're interrupting lunch. What are you talking about? Of course, I didn't say that. I'm a PFC at the time. I don't say much to anybody unless someone asks or tells me to. But we load back up in a truck, driven back to the company area, and we're told we're going with the 82nd. I guess we're not going to Germany. Where are we going? Just shut up, grab your stuff. And I think we must have already had our rucksacks packed, because I don't remember running back to the barracks and stuffing backpacks. But that Monday afternoon, Monday night, into Tuesday morning, into very late at night Tuesday, was all preparations, waiting around for something to happen. A very, very cold night, Monday night into Tuesday morning, in a mostly unheated tent in very cold North Carolina winter temperatures, to then load up onto Air Force 141s, leaving Pope Air Force Base. I think we must have left sometime around midnight, the 19th into the 20th, and then we jumped into Panama. My stick was at about 5 a.m., maybe 4:55. I think somebody figured out at one point. Kicking off Operation Just Cause as a PFC on a 2-man loudspeaker team. My team sergeant, Paul Backstrom, had half of the loudspeaker team in his rucksack. He landed on one of the tarmacs of the runways, which broke the amplifier in his backpack. I had more of the radio pack, so we were now combat ineffective to be a loudspeaker team. And the infantry, company battalion we were attached to, 4th Battalion of the 325th Airborne Infantry Regiment, now we're just kind of wannabe 1811 Bravo, or 11 Bravos, hanging out with airborne infantry guys. That was a very warm morning. We had left very cold temperatures. We had left Fort Bragg, Pope Air Force Base during an ice storm. I remember having ice on our shoulders, on our helmets, and we're not wearing jackets, just a uniform. I don't think I even had a long sleeve shirt on underneath. Really cold conditions, to then be jumping into 90-degree temperatures. And most of us only had 2 canteens. And I probably drank both canteens before the sun even came up. The Rangers from 75th Ranger Regiment who had jumped in ahead of us had already, fought over the airport. I remember at some point a truck comes out bringing water, and they had repurposed probably 5-gallon tubs of cooking oil or whatever was in those to fill them with water, so that as they were poured into our canteens, we had a little, layer of oil that we'd have to squeeze and blow off the top to get to the water. So now it's warm, winter's hundreds of miles away from me, and I'm just trying to find out what we need to be doing, realizing we can't broadcast anything on loudspeaker teams. So we're just part of the group. We jump into helicopters. We move a relatively short distance over to where the Panamanians had, I believe it's called Fort Cimarron, kind of their version of Fort Benning. I think it was their infantry school. There was a battalion of wheeled light armored vehicles that was there. So by the time we're off the helicopters in place kind of around this fort with this infantry battalion, night falls, and then the Air Force takes over with AC-130s, A-37 Dragonfly attack planes, and just strafing bombing, shooting at, I guess, anything that was moving inside Fort Cimarron. And then the next morning we load up into some Humvees that showed up from somewhere, and we get driven maybe less than a mile into the center of the fort. And I don't see any dead bodies. I don't see any sign of impact. It just looks abandoned. And we were there, I guess, for a night or two before loading up into a CH-47 Chinook and being taken into downtown Panama City. And by this time we've had one, I guess it was a skirmish. Somebody had started shooting, down that end of the perimeter, and it just kind of dominoed. And so whoever was slightly to my right, as they were shooting, I thought, well, if they're shooting at something, they must see it. So I popped off a couple rounds. I don't even know if I hit a tree. Couldn't see anything. There was no night vision goggles, anywhere near me. So that, brief firefight, if that's what it was, then we're after getting into downtown Panama in broad daylight off the back of a Chinook helicopter, somebody in one of the high-rise buildings was taking pot shots at the collective group of us. I don't remember anything landing around me. I remember a couple of the infantry guys returning fire. I guess they thought they could see what they were shooting at. But as quickly as it started, it was over. And then we spend the better part of a day or so hanging out at that little airstrip. It's where Noriega had his Learjet staged, and of course the SEALs, as they came ashore for their initial phase of the attack, they take that jet out, and I think suffered some pretty serious losses in their action on that field. But this is, 2 days after that, at least. That night we did a patrol, foot patrol up into, I would say, more of the center of the city. Another one of our loudspeaker teams had strapped their loudspeaker to a borrowed civilian pickup truck to really broadcast, hey, we're coming in, don't shoot at us, we're here to help, in Spanish, of course. And at the time we were using the old 1980s vintage Walkman radio cassette players. At least in our group, I don't think any of us spoke Spanish. So we were reliant upon cassette tapes that had been pre-made before we left Fort Bragg with all sorts of messages. You're surrounded, please don't engage, we're here to help. So at this stage, I'm still an ineffective loudspeaker team member because we don't have a loudspeaker, but following this larger patrol, mostly on foot, to go to a center point in the town. A couple of stops along the way because somebody somewhere was shooting at us, single shots, maybe from a pistol. And if one of the Panamanians was shooting at us, 25 to 30 Americans would then return fire and the shooting would stop. Were they hitting anything? Who knows? Again, it's pitch black dark. You can't see anything. There's a little bit of urban lighting, but I couldn't tell anything that was going on. At this stage, I've now just approached my 1 year in service. I'm a PFC. I barely understand what I do in the Army, and really just hanging out following whatever Paul, my team sergeant, is telling me to do. At the end of that night, we end up at a large intersection, four-way divided, downtown roads. And the company that we were with ended up moving into a food warehouse, and we stayed inside this food warehouse. Really, I think the goal for the entry unit was to secure that intersection, because by this time, we don't want free flowing traffic. There's a curfew in place. Civilians can't move about freely, and we're just held up, staged in a food warehouse. The next big event for us, we somehow link up with one of our, I think at the time he must have been a company commander, a captain, who brings us to another large grouping, 10, 15 of us loudspeaker guys. And Paul and I get in the back of a truck and we're driven over to a school. Our good friend Manny Valenzuela from the 1st PSYOP Battalion had already started doing loudspeaker broadcasts just outside the Papal Nuncio, the Vatican embassy, where Manuel Noriega had sought refuge and sanctuary, fleeing, the Americans that had come to capture him. So Manny sets up his loudspeaker, and he's not broadcasting at Noriega. He's broadcasting up at a large circular Holiday Inn hotel, because members of the media were there with parabolic microphones trying to listen in on negotiations taking place right outside the front gate of the Nuncio. And, the generals or whomever determined, like, we don't want them hearing what we're talking about. Hey, loudspeaker guys, broadcast something so that their parabolic mics are inoperative. So Manny's first system would have been battery powered. I'm sure he was running low on battery supplies. And as Paul and I get there, we just relieve him for, probably 3-hour blocks of time, set up our loudspeaker system that we had replaced with a newer one, to then continue broadcasting up at the building. I don't remember seeing the parabolic mics all that often. They would come out every once in a while, maybe if they saw that we were changing batteries and changing tapes. And I don't know that I've ever sat down and figured out exactly how many hours were we broadcasting continuously. I don't think we were doing it at all hours of the day and night. I really don't remember doing it at 2 o'clock in the morning. Maybe we were.
What are you broadcasting?
So anything that we could broadcast from these Walkmans. And the easiest thing, the thing that wouldn't drain the batteries, was broadcasting Armed Forces Radio Network.
Okay.
So I believe there was a station set up somewhere in Panama City. So whatever they were playing, and I think the standard rotation back then would have been, maybe a good rock and roll song followed by maybe a good country western song followed by maybe an R&B song. A public service announcement for 5 minutes. Hey, we're still, in lockdown. Don't drive around. Stay on your bases. And now here's a song, some song, and I wish I'd written these down. I Fought the Law and the Law Won. I don't remember them playing that, but all these themed songs that if you search the internet now, apparently we played.
Okay.
And it's not as if we had predetermined schedules or song lists. Like if we get, Manuel Noriega entrapped in some location, we're going to play, harassing songs, Welcome to the Jungle. No, that was a popular song at that time. So if the AFN disc jockey's playing that, that's what's coming across our radio and then blasted out of the loudspeaker. My favorite part in that was a local kid, maybe 13, 14 years old, who lives somewhere in the immediate neighborhood. As we were walking around one day, I don't know how he knew, but he hands me a cassette tape, and a pre-made cassette tape that he had loaded up with a bunch of different Metallica songs. And I'm like, okay. At that time, of course I'd heard of Metallica, and when it was my turn to get back on the Walkman, put that in and played it. He wasn't nearby, but maybe he heard his songs being broadcast. But the notion that we had some kind of playlist, that's not how it really happened. We were just playing whatever was being broadcast over AFN radio. Maybe once in a while, if one of us did bring a tape, maybe we put that tape in. But at that stage, I did not deploy with any of my own personal tapes. That would come later in Desert Storm. that was kind of the end of like fun, exciting, eye-opening activity for me there in Panama. And then I think it was exactly 3 weeks to the date. We're loading up a plane to then be flown back to Pope Air Force Base, and we unload, put our rucksacks, and somebody from the company, I'm sure the company commander, the first sergeant, had come to pick us up. I don't know if any, maybe some of the married soldiers, that their wives or children showed up. I don't remember seeing, a big welcoming crowd. I remember just, kind of loading up. We went back to the barracks that night. I'm pretty sure we went out for food. We went to an Italian restaurant that we all loved. And then it may have been the next day or the day after that, I drove home to see my family in South Carolina. And remember driving down Interstate 95 thinking, did that just happen? That was a weird 3 weeks. At the time, I don't consider myself a veteran, but I considered myself lucky. We had soldiers and other servicemen killed in Panama, and I come through, without a scratch, without anything. So, fortunate for that experience, and to have been around Paul, who's my team sergeant, who's still one of my best friends. We talk frequently. To give him credit for making sure I didn't do anything that I shouldn't have been doing, right, or stepping somewhere, or getting hurt or whatever. So that kind of initial baptism by fire also, I would say, probably gave us a little bit of a false sense of invincibility, because having jumped out of that 141 at 800 feet, or I think maybe 500 feet, we then end up with a little bronze star on the airborne parachutist patches that we wore. So to be walking around Fort Bragg with a little gold star that you really didn't see too many people wearing,
signifies you jumped in combat?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
So, as a skinny PFC at the time, the thousands of us who were part of that jump, walking around with a little extra swagger, extra pride, our berets are a little bit tighter on our heads. And I remember going to one of the taverns, the Green Beret Sport Parachute Club. I don't think it's really open anymore. And you'd see some of the older veterans, Korea era veterans, Vietnam era veterans, and knowing like, I wonder if they have a star. And realizing like, we better watch like kind of how cocky we are. 3 weeks to me, doesn't equate to what somebody may have experienced for 3 years. But we were I wouldn't say treated differently, but we got a chance to engage with the schoolhouse back at the JFK Special Warfare Center in schools. We were interviewed by the historian at the command. I was part of a two-man team who went to a reserve unit in Columbus, Ohio for a week to hang out with their loudspeaker teams, because we had been in recent combat. Like, what do you do when your loudspeaker doesn't work? How do you react to being under fire if you've got to change out cassette tapes? So at the end of that week in Columbus, that Friday morning we woke up and we knew we would be leaving them that afternoon to fly back to Fayetteville. That was the day that Saddam Hussein and the Iraqis invaded Kuwait. And I remember kind of as we were getting up in the hotel watching it on the morning news, thinking, wonder if that's going to have any impact on my life. And sure enough, by October of that year, having been stood up and stood down and alerted and hurry up, get your packs, we're going today. The massive flow of personnel and equipment and just the entire effort to then go to what was Desert Shield, our load really didn't come up until I think it was the middle of October, to then fly, first over to Germany, refueling there, and then on into Saudi Arabia. The initial part of Saudi Arabia is tons and tons of hurry up and wait. There's nothing to do. We have deployed with our backpacks. Maybe we had a duffel bag with extra stuff in it. a rifle, a couple of easily transported loudspeaker systems, but at the time no Humvees. So realizing this is going to be more of a flat desert, vast scale combat if this is what happens, as opposed to, foot patrols in the middle of a Panamanian city with a little bit of, I didn't do it, but, kind of jungle patrols that would be appropriate for a two-man loudspeaker team. But how do you employ a two-man loudspeaker team if it's going to be open desert? Our speakers can't broadcast far enough in that kind of environment. We did a couple of training exercises with the 82nd Airborne. We tried to do what we thought we could as part of a grander scale desert combat training exercise. But my favorite part of that exercise was as the opposition force, other American units are coming in and attacking the force that I was a part of. The main part of our force leaves and, retreats, moves back to another defensible position. We get left on the side of this desert mesa. A two-man loudspeaker team in jungle boots with our backpacks. And one armored vehicle goes by us, like, do you guys need help? Like, no, but please tell somebody that we're here. We don't want to be abandoned out here in this vast Saudi desert in the middle of Saudi Arabia, kind of between Dhahran and Riyadh. And the next vehicle that came up was, I believe, the assistant or the assistant deputy commander or some one-star general in the 82nd Airborne. What are you guys? What are you guys doing? Hey, sir, we're one of the loudspeaker teams. Why are you not with the unit? We don't know. And I think the two of us knew enough. We're not going to badmouth anybody. Those guys abandoned us. But I guess we didn't, we didn't see the call to load up, or we were really far away from. We weren't within eyesight of our next supported unit, and I remember thinking like, okay, now he's going to drive away, and of course he in with his staff and his Humvee, they left, and about 15 minutes later another one shows up and we load up on that, and that's the end of our training exercise. Probably spent weeks back in Dhahran. At this time, our unit had been attached to the 9th Psychological Operations Battalion, and moving us out of a tent in a holding encampment, living in GP mediums, was terrible. And so the 9th Battalion figured out, like, hey, we can lease a house. And we lived in a very large, I guess it was probably a single-family Saudi home, but with many bedrooms. And so what they had bought or leased bunk beds, and so we probably had 12 guys, in bunk beds in one bedroom, in maybe 5 or 6 or 7 bedrooms. So, there were probably 150 of us living in this house, which of course maxed out the plumbing, with MREs probably for lunch, and then a catered breakfast dinner service, which was great. Absolutely no complaints about that. And at the time, there's nothing to do. The sergeants are trying to get us to do, remedial training, do some kind of drills. We tried to do some kind of PT in the day. It's not as hot as it was when we arrived in October, but it's still, not a great place to do much of anything. Yeah. If we were lucky, we would find a way to borrow a vehicle and maybe go into town to, buy food, buy some Cokes or something, but absolutely nothing to do. We read a lot of books. For me, the next big exciting moment was doing another staging with the 82nd, but to then be part of a greater 18th Airborne Corps deception mission, where we went up into the corner of Saudi Arabia that's really bordered by Kuwait on two sides. We knew the Iraqis were on that opposite side of the border, to be doing a fake Corps level TOC setup, Tactical Operations Center, so that the Iraqis would think this is where we're building a huge encampment to then be going, straight up into Kuwait when it's time to attack. No, it was just a bunch of us who were appearing to be a larger unit with the communications, electronic broadcasts and missions. And then we were brought along with our vehicle-mounted loudspeaker systems. By this time, we had Humvees that had come from somewhere. And so to be able to broadcast from a much more powerful vehicle-mounted system, I think it was a 900 watt as opposed to a 250 watt loudspeaker backpack system, to broadcast tank noises, machinery, so that if someone was close enough to hear us, and I honestly don't remember how close we were to the border, they would hear like the faint sound of machinery and think like, man, there must be something building down there. Tactics that had been employed all the way back through Korea and first utilized in World War II, made famous by the Ghost Army, to fake the Germans out, thinking this is where an armored attack was going to be coming, when really it was coming from this direction. It was on that training mission that I think was when the air war started, and somebody woke us up, sleeping in a small tent or something, like, hey, come out, you got to come check this out. And I remember going out, in maybe just my PT clothes and looking up and seeing nothing. Somebody handed me night vision goggles, and then you could see just the lines of airplanes flying north. You couldn't identify what they were, but by listening to the BBC or other shortwave radio, we knew this is the air war kicking off. By this time, my own battalion, the 6th Battalion, had deployed to Saudi Arabia. They had set up a battalion forward location at King Khalid Military City, and then deployed out additional teams. And so we were brought back in, cut loose from the 9th Battalion and attached back into a 6th Battalion team. Picked up a Humvee. By this time, we were a 4-man loudspeaker team. Mark Mahan is our team sergeant. Alan Varville and I were both corporals. And then Jassim was a Kuwaiti college student 4 months prior, going to school, I think in southern Florida somewhere, and had been drafted by his government in exile by the Kuwaiti embassy. Hey, you're going to go through some remedial quick training in Fort Dix, and then you're going to be attached to an American Army unit. And he ends up in our Humvee. Our mission was to then be attached to whomever we thought we needed to be attached to. And initially we were loosely affiliated with the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, but then cut loose for a mission with the 1st Cavalry Division, as they were doing, I think, what is described as a feint operation up at the border to, again, all this, to show the Iraqis, like, hey, this is where we're attacking, when in reality we're going to do that famous left hook. So as the 1st Cav is moving forward on that operation, we were instructed to go up, I think it was to within 1,500 meters of the border, do a real quick U-turn, have the speakers pointed up north, play whatever we were going to play. It was probably going to be surrender appeals. You're going to be attacked by the American Army. You should surrender and start walking south, in Arabic. And so we would have had cassette tapes with these messages, or just hand the microphone to Jassim and say, hey, talk slowly, talk clearly, but, tell these Iraqi guys if they don't want to die, to start surrendering. Nobody surrendered. I think we were too far away, although instead of getting to within 1,500 meters, the Bradley Cav vehicle that we were following behind, they took us to within 500 meters of the berm, because you're realizing, like, I shouldn't be close enough to see the berm. I knew something was wrong and thought, we're just going to do like as much as we can to broadcast as many times as we're able to, but then we need to be further south. We're in an unarmored, 1980s version of a Humvee. We have no protection from anything. And we were 4 guys with M16A2s. The Bradley was a comforting thought if they had to cover us, but to be that close to the border. And the other problem with being close to the border was the artillery barrage that had started was going directly over our heads, and we could see the rounds impacting on the other side of the border. We could see the airbursts landing, above the heads of what must have been fighting positions. I never saw an Iraqi person, truck, but we knew they were just over the border. We got too close.
Yeah.
And eventually when Mark, the team sergeant, decides like, hey, let's start moving south, we did start moving south again. We had no GPS in the vehicles. We had no ability to do our own real land nav. If we were going to move independently, we would go into a talk, find out where we were on a map, looking up, on a big board and seeing the map. Okay, we're here. We now need to go over to this battalion over here, and figuring out on the map what that azimuth was. Okay, we need to shoot an azimuth of 260 degrees, and we need to drive for about 10 kilometers on a featureless desert. And we just drive for 500 or 600 or 700 meters. Mark would get out, shoot another azimuth, and say, "Do you see that little rise over there? Aim for that." And miraculously, we somehow would end up in at least visible range of, oh, there's the next talk. Thank God we were good at land navigation. We had learned in the forests around Fort Bragg and knew how to shoot azimuths and be cognizant of the metal around the Humvee. Mark would get out and walk away from the Humvee to shoot his azimuth so that we didn't end up taking too many turns to the right and end up approaching the berm as an mostly unprotected, independent little vehicle with 4 guys in it. Thank God for our land navigation abilities. The other pretty cool thing that we did, we spent probably 3 days attached to the 5th Special Forces Group in the border town of Ruki, where Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Kuwait all meet. And this Special Forces A team had been there. They were there, I think, primarily to ensure that the greater Allied armored force, I think it was mostly Egyptians in that sector, in American-made M60 tanks, that they were connected and tied into and part of the greater effort. But this A-team, these 18 series guys, they also had a first generation laser target designator. And on one of the days we were with them, we went up into on top of this very tall water tower, and it had the town had already been impacted by Iraqi artillery, and you could see signs of damaged buildings. I found a large piece of shrapnel and thought, man, I don't ever need to come anywhere near artillery in my life. But as 3 of us went up on top of the water tank, and I knew it was a laser designator. I didn't want to touch it. I knew it was expensive. I'm not trained on it. I don't want to bump it. I may have peeked, behind the scope at one point, but I couldn't tell what I was looking at. It's just a flat desert. Alan got behind it and spent a minute or two, and he said, "Hey, what is that?" And he goes, "I see something out there." And one of the SF guys, after Alan moved, got down behind and said, "Oh my God, you just found another column, another armored column." And I'm thinking, what's the chance that our Alan, has found something that these guys, who are trained, on this equipment, who their job is to be doing strategic reconnaissance, but Alan's the guy who's found a tank that they're trying to look for. Didn't know it, but that night, while we're back in the house that the team had occupied, I don't remember seeing any civilians. It wasn't much of a real town. It was more of just a border posting, and with the wartime setting, I'm sure there were no border agents or others. But in the house that we were in, seems like it was the middle of the night. I don't remember exactly what time it was, but a very large series of explosions were taking place, I think about 5 miles from where we were, and the SF team had called in a bunch of B-52s. And as we then get up, when the sun comes up, this massive cloud of dark smoke coming out of the site where the bombs had dropped. and the bombing campaign there had been successful. They had knocked out this entire Iraqi column. And we were telling, our guys when we hooked up with him later on, like, Alan found this, and they're like, Alan did? Amazing. This was all before the ground war kicks off. So that then by the time we get back to 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, we're then attached down to, I believe it was what they would describe as squadron levels. And we're then attached to the cavalry units to then cross the berm, going into Iraq. I'm pretty confident that the 2nd ACR went a day before the rest of the Corps. And I think we were already, a day's drive into Iraq before the ground war technically started. The first sign I knew that we had encountered anybody were 3 little dots on the horizon as I'm driving our Humvee and just a line behind, I think they call them the combat trains. Other Humvees, support trucks. I don't even remember being close enough to see Bradleys or Abrams tanks. But I remember seeing 3 dots on the horizon. Somebody in our truck had seen them. And later on we identified, oh, those are humans. They're people walking. And it was just 3 Iraqi soldiers who apparently had been walking for about a week or so. And when we pause, they end up in our truck. And 2 of us get out so Mark and Jossam can then interview them one at a time. I think we would have called it an interrogation. But these guys would have told us anything we wanted to know. I was in this unit, here's where I'm from, my commander's name is this. They were hungry, thirsty. I remember cutting open a couple of MREs to give them, and they ate everything in the MRE. They ate the coffee powder. They ate the sugar packets. They were hungry dudes who just wanted to be out of the war. I'm sure they had seen some bad stuff up where they were. And then being part of the ACR's, move into Iraq, I don't ever remember being close enough to hear the gunfire, the cannon fire from the tanks and the Bradleys. But as then we move forward, within a few minutes of them engaging, you would spot a blown up Iraqi tank or a blown up personnel carrier to realize, yeah, we're moving forward. But as a loudspeaker team, we weren't going to be stopping long enough to really tell anybody surrender. We may have broadcast 1 or 2 surrender appeals, but at this stage, things are moving too fast. The armored punch is moving too fast, and the Cav was not going to stop and take prisoners. We've got to get to their objectives so that the rest of the huge armored corps behind us can keep moving forward to engage and cut off the Iraqi armor. So we didn't do that many broadcasts. We didn't do that many surrender appeals. I think we did a few more interrogations of Iraqi soldiers, onesies and twosies who had been encountered. But I think it was maybe the first day of the truce. Mark came back from probably, a briefing inside the talk, talking to the S3 or somebody, and said, hey, bring the system, bring the man-pack system. We're going to go up and broadcast up here on this hill. And I thought, what are we doing? And at about this time, I realized they're getting into formation. I've not seen a true dress right dress Army formation in weeks or months. Everything was pretty tactically deployed. And what it was a memorial service that the regiment was having for those members who had been killed in the night or two before. And they had the combat cross with, and we're maybe 100 yards away from where they're really formed. But at that distance, you recognize what the combat cross is, the boots and the rifle and the helmet. And we're going to play taps. And, with the Walkman and the small loudspeaker system at an appropriate level. We're not going to try and deafen anybody, but we play taps. And we can tell when they're being brought to attention, and I guess Mark must have talked to the sergeant major or somebody, when you see us doing this, play taps. And we knew to come to the position of attention. And that was one of those real gut punch moments. Much like, the knuckleheaded guy that I was in Panama, realizing some of the damaged vehicles that we had seen. I think we had probably even seen one or two American vehicles that had been impacted, realizing this is for them. And that was not something we ever trained on. That was not something we ever discussed. And I give Mark full credit for knowing that's something that we could do. Or maybe, maybe one of the CAV guys knew, like, hey, can you guys play taps? And that was, I think that was important to us as a small team, and I know it was helpful for the troopers in the regiment to have that for their ceremony. I don't think anybody videotaped it. I don't think there's any recording of it. In those days, nobody had a lot of rolls of camera film to be taking the picture, but I can see it as if I'm still standing on that little rise in the desert to see down the slight decline where they were all formed. And I'd like to think that we made a positive impact on them that day. Within a day or two, there's nothing much for us to do. Everybody's thought is, are we going home soon? Is it time to redeploy? And by this time, nobody knows. I guess we've been in country for maybe 4 months, in theater for 4 or 5 months. No, my time was not up. We moved back to where the battalion was, cleaned up the vehicles, got resupplied with, maybe more food or something like that, maybe did laundry. But then somebody said, hey, why don't you guys go be part of this, smaller detachment? I was eventually attached to the 1st Armored Division at the division headquarters for a week or so. I got to spend maybe less than a full week with 7th Corps assigned to their headquarters. So to occasionally be the PSYOP team sergeant wearing corporal rank on my uniform to go into a Corps talk and seeing, generals and a lot of colonels and a lot of, sergeants major, and realize, again, don't speak unless spoken to. Don't touch anything. But, to maybe hang out watching career, dedicated, very well trained, very well employed soldiers in something like a Corps, command center, that was freaking awesome. It would kind of set me up to appreciate when the hub of activity is there within that much of a command center, realizing, of course, the armed edge of the spear are really out around us. And having been, close to a Bradley, close to a Humvee, close to a Special Forces team, as they're engaging and realizing I have a pretty specialized supporting role that doesn't always get employed. But it was pretty impactful for me to realize, wow, this is what the Army is about. And realizing, at one point, the guy who's my detachment commander, and I think at that point it was just he and I, and he's a Vietnam veteran captain who I think would retire within maybe months of getting back home. But thinking like he and I are part of this greater team. On the way back, before we got back into Saudi Arabia to then redeploy, we actually drove into Kuwait City, I think to drop Jassim, our interpreter, off at his house. His war was over. He invited us in to have dinner with his family, and it was a fantastic meal. I remember thinking, like, he's fortunate, like his family's here, that they survived, that they were not victimized when the Iraqis were, besieging Kuwait City, that they had enough, means to then provide us with a fantastic meal. It was one of the best dinners I've ever had. And then in the back of my mind, as we're driving back into Saudi Arabia, the very long, boring drive in an uncomfortable Humvee, is it time for us to go home? And we spent, I think, probably another 2 weeks before it was time to go home. And the greatest part of that redeployment was unknown to me at the time. was my dad and my youngest brother were at the tarmac when we got back to Pope Air Force Base. And to see them and realize, like, that's kind of cool, you know, to not come home, and not that I think we needed it. I just want to go back, you know, change the civilian clothes, go eat at that Italian restaurant again. But to have family there, Plainside, was pretty cool. For me, that was a nice evolution because I would then spend the better part of 2 more years in battalion staff. And part of what I was, I don't remember telling anybody, but I wanted people to have better training than I got. Not that I had bad training, I just didn't have lots of opportunity for training before I went to Panama with the 82nd. Or I then, you know, was part of this massive armored effort, you know, as a vehicle-mounted loudspeaker team member. I didn't understand how the American, you know, ground divisions would employ or deploy. And I don't think that we did enough training to better inform our soldiers as to what we would be doing when we would be deploying. And so to be moving up into a battalion training officer role, to be helping out with setting up rifle ranges, land navigation training ranges, was important for me to get the next generation. It's ridiculous because at the time I'm a 23-year-old, but you know, the 18 and 19-year-olds who were coming behind me, give them some of the benefit that we didn't have because we really didn't get trained on it. And thankfully, we wouldn't really need massive armored training expertise. But my next deployment was to Haiti in 1994, when the Haitian government was causing problems in the region and the U.S. government decided we were going to invade. Watching, and by this time I'm in battalion. No, by this time I was back in another battalion. But knowing that we were going to be sending guys with the 82nd, with the Rangers by this time, we'd had guys who had gotten slots to be Ranger trained so that they could be better connected to a Ranger company if that's who they were going to deploy with. We had built up the capabilities of our loudspeaker teams. And I was back not on a team, but I was in a loudspeaker company because I had injured my knee playing flag football in an Army, you know, afternoon weekend league, so I couldn't be on jump status. And somebody must have said, well, he can still operate a loudspeaker. He can operate the one in the helicopter. So I'm kind of, you know, I was kind of bummed out that I can't be on a 1 or 2 man or a 2 or 3 man team who might be going to support the Rangers or going back to the 82nd. And I remember my first sergeant at the time, Thomas Murtha, coming up to me a couple times. And by this time I'm an E6. And he said, hey, Sergeant Freeman, I'm going to get a real jump star. Like, come on, First Sergeant. Like, you know, it's not a competition. But of course, you know, in the minds of young men, it is a competition. I want to have what he has. So I thought, well, I'm not going to get a jump star on this one. But I was kind of fired up to do the helicopter mounted. It's a very large loudspeaker system with a huge amplifier that has to be connected to the electrical system in whatever helicopter it's going to be connected to, a Huey, a Black Hawk. And I had actually done training exercises with both Army aviators and the Marines, as we knew that we were gearing up for some kind of operation that would probably be focused on Haiti. And eventually, you know, the company commander says, hey, Freeman, you know, you're taking the loudspeaker system, we're going to fly you down, you're going to get hooked up with the Marines. So I think we flew, our detachment flew on the C-5 to Guantanamo Bay. We all then got on a Marine helicopter to be flown out to the USS Wasp, an assault carrier. They're going to be, the rest of the detachment, probably 10 of us, they're all going to be attached to the Marine infantry companies as 2 and 3 man loudspeaker teams. Our detachment commander, who was a major, Craig Cowell, and our detachment NCOIC, Bill Miniman, they would have been attached, I think, probably battalion headquarters. Um, and I get attached to a Huey. So that's awesome. Figure out the technical aspects that I had barely been trained on, attach that into the Huey. So when it's time for the green light to be turned on and we're going, um, I'm ready to go in a heavily armored and loudspeaker equipped Huey, Vietnam era vintage, but modernized helicopter. And everybody was keyed up, and I remember watching a bunch of Marines sharpening their K-bars and going with double combat load magazines, thinking, that's going to get heavy later on. And of course, I think it was the night before the intended invasion. I guess the diplomats of the State Department and maybe whomever else convinced the regime in Haiti, like, you don't want this. You need to step down. And so there was no invasion, but there was a non-combatant, I would say, incursion of American forces into Haiti that day. And I didn't think about it at the time, but I remember thinking about it later. Like, my first sergeant, who was going to be on a loudspeaker team, he was part of the group that had flown out of Fayetteville, or I'm sorry, Fort Bragg Pope Air Force Base, but turned around mid-flight, that they did not jump into Haiti. And it would be weeks later when I would see the first sergeant again, and I probably busted his chops like, hey, you didn't get that star you talked about. I probably did push-ups for that one. But did get to utilize my loudspeaker hanging out. The speaker was hanging out. I was not hanging out the side of a Huey, and mostly to do broadcasts around large towns, populated areas, if the Marines were going to be going in by helo. So we would circle first where the Americans were here peacefully. Please don't shoot at us. Please stay off the streets. And these would be broad daylight landings in the huge CH-53 helicopters with entire platoons of Marines coming out the back. And occasionally some of our loudspeaker guys coming out with them. And we would just stay up in orbit around them, broadcasting, don't mess with the Americans, we're here to help. And then my personal favorite point of all that was the helicopters got to be refueled, so we'd have to go back to the ship. If we knew we were going to be refueling and maybe the pilots were going to change out, we might have 2 or 3 hours before I was going to go back out and broadcast again. So that what a great time to go down and change into a fresh uniform. If I had enough time, I might take a hot shower. And on one of the trips, and it's certainly a good meal in the Navy mess, I ate like a champ on that deployment, probably gained weight. And occasionally, if we would go into what would be the Marine headquarters element ashore, I'd get out and go find where my detachment commander was, and maybe relaying information, because I would sometimes get on communications back to Bragg, passing information. And I remember one of the guys came up to me one time and kind of sniffed me, like, what are you doing? What's wrong with you? You smell clean. I said, I'm clean because I take 2 to 3 showers a day, unlike you slobs living in the gutters. I was probably made fun of that for a couple of years. So eventually on that deployment comes to an end. I think I only spent one night sleeping on a cot in Haiti before we flew back to Fort Bragg. And the next deployment was as a response to the war, the civil war and regional unrest in the former Yugoslavia. And we had done one training, or maybe it was 2 training deployments to Germany to better train the American units that would be deploying from European Command into Bosnia if we were going to get the order to go. And so by this stage, still a staff sergeant, but as part of what we were calling, I think at the time, a corps or division PSYOP support element. So it was mostly tabletop exercises. I stayed in a hotel We drove into, the industrial looking building where a talk had been set up to better inform and train the decision makers, the leaders of those units. If you're going to be using a PSYOP team, here's how you're going to be doing it. Here are the limitations, here's the capabilities, requirements. And so that was more of informing them. And then, of course, we got the order to go, I think it was between Thanksgiving and Christmas of 1995. I can't remember if I missed Thanksgiving that year or not, when NATO was finally ordered to go in. And I was part of the NATO headquarters element. I won't remember the acronym. And so this was a combined multinational headquarters element led by a British, I think, 3 or 4 star general. And we were the leading psychological operations element attached to this combined headquarters. And we first go into what must have been like a large ski resort chalet up in the mountains of Bosnia in a town called Kislyak, where the United Nations had been set up first. And so we're replacing them. And we must have had 1 or 2 days of overlap. My favorite part of the combined time we had with them was the Nepalese soldiers who were part of the Gurkha regiment company, whatever. They had their own part of the chow hall where you could go get Nepalese food. And I looked over at the food in the British Army line and thought, I'm going to go in the Nepalese food, and had, curried lamb or whatever it was, a much better meal service than what the British were serving. And the United Nations leaves, NATO comes in, our headquarters gets larger. I think Bosnia was split up into the British sector, French sector, American sector. I think it was first Armored Cav who comes in. And so we're not only managing keeping the NATO headquarters informed, but also ensuring that our loudspeaker teams and PSYOP support teams who are coming in with the American forces are better connected, informed, supplied, anything that would have been needed for their efforts. And most of the effort was informing the Bosnian populace, whether Serb influenced, Croatian influenced. Here are the terms of the Dayton Peace Accord. Here's where the lines are going to be drawn. Don't move across them. Don't drive your tanks. Don't fly your planes. They may have done some loose loudspeaker operations, but mostly it was a leaflet, poster, newspaper, TV, and radio campaign. And keeping all sorts of moving parts. And by this time, I'm a glorified clerk typist. I had cut the fingertips out of my glove insert so that I could type on a very crappy laptop, connected to some server so that our messages could be sent back to European Command in Germany, but then also back to Fort Bragg and probably onto the Pentagon. The highlight for me in that deployment was being able to work the joint arena with British. It was a mostly British supported, but there would be Italian officers and German officers and French officers and all manner of NATO forces where we were working. And at one point I remember a German NCO, maybe the same rank as I was, came in and asked to have all of our floppy disks scanned. And I thought, no, I'm American Army. I'm pretty cognizant of how we contain secured and classified information. No one's told me to share it. I'm not sharing it. And there was a little bit of a toe-to-toe meeting between 2 NCOs. No, I'm not giving them to you. And he must have stormed off and told somebody. And eventually, my battalion commander, who is leading our detachment, said, Sergeant Freeman, yeah, he can have the discs. And the reason for the search was somebody had infected the team with the virus, and it was one of our discs. It was me. I won't point the finger at who I know may have used an unauthorized disk in an unauthorized system. I'll save that person from embarrassment. But I then had to go seek out that German NCO and apologize to him. Hey, you were doing your job. Yes, it was one of our guys who did that, and thank you for helping correct us. I bought him a very large beer that night. That was the kind of cool thing that we didn't talk about very much. Being attached to a British Army element, the standard theater rule of no drinking in theater, we were told by the American one-star General Sylvester, who was, I believe, our operations chief, like, hey, if we're attached to the British Army, we're going to follow the British Army's rules. And so, yes, we can have 2 beers a night. And the joke amongst the British guys was nobody ever said how large or how small the beers could be. And sometimes it was my duty as the senior NCO on our little 10-man detachment to make sure if the younger guys had had a good night the night before, to speed up their hangover recovery so they could go back to doing, what they had to do for the day. We were living at that time in what I would describe as a war-torn, bombed-out hotel, kind of Soviet-era design. It wasn't the fanciest hotel I'd ever visited. Where our command center was a historic old, maybe 200 or 300-year-old kind of fancy old building hotel. The ballroom was where the main operations center was set up. But the hotel that we were in was a short distance across a larger, in times of peace, a resort complex. And I think it goes back to even 17th, 16th century when kings and royalty would have come to this site because there were hot springs there. But the hotel that we lived in was certainly, battle damaged during the Civil War around Sarajevo. And at one point we went up on the roof, just on a good day. We wanted to go, see what we could see. And somebody pointed out a bunch of bullet holes. And I knew enough about bullet impacts and thought, like, those aren't coming in with any kind of angle. It's not as if they had been arced in. If somebody across the river was shooting at us, those were coming in a fairly straight trajectory. And we looked where we were standing, and then somebody pointed out, do those look like drag marks? And we had found out that I think it was the Serbs. Somebody, when they had held that hotel, had probably executed people standing next to that wall. And that was one of those moments where you realize this is a real civil war, and that there were atrocities. And after being shot there, the bodies were then dragged across and dropped off the 3 or 4 story rooftop. Of course, that may have happened a year ago. It may have happened 2 years ago. There was nothing we can do about it. But I remember we talked about that a couple times, and that was impactful to see that. The hotel was mostly unheated, and a Bosnian winter is one of the coldest winters I've ever experienced. And when somebody finally figured out how to clean out the massive water heater in the basement of the hotel to get hot water piped up to the rooms, and I got my first hot shower in probably weeks. I am in the hotel room, and there were probably 6 of us per hotel room. So this was not luxury living. On cots, we were eating MREs probably twice a day at that stage. I don't remember eating in the chow hall. Maybe we did. But my first shower, I'm going to take my time and enjoy the hot water. And my hair might have been a little bit long for standard Army standards at that time. And I remember having a full head of lather, soapy shampoo lather, and then I hear gunfire. And for the most part, there was no gunfire any time in the, I think, 3 months that we were in Bosnia. Somebody shot an RPG into this hotel area. It landed on a roof not far from where I was in the early evening. I didn't see the impact, but I heard slate tiles falling. But I didn't think anything of it. It was a a one-time bang that had happened weeks earlier. Now I'm in the shower, full head, and I'm like, I don't care about gunshots. You know, if this is where I die, if somehow a bullet comes into the bathroom and this is where I die, that's fine with me, because I'm going to die warm and I'm going to die clean. And of course, you know, the bullets never came anywhere near us. At that point, this outer perimeter security was Italian infantry, and I'm sure they responded to the sniper, who probably had an AK or some kind of simple rifle. And they probably responded with automatic fire. And I remember coming out of the shower, you know, when I finally toweled off, and they're like, "Idiot, you got to put your Kevlar on." I said, "Guys, we've not heard a gunshot in 3 minutes. I think we're okay." That would have been February of '96. By that time, I knew that I was not going to re-enlist. I knew that I would do just my 8 years and get out. I probably had one more training parachute jump. I think I had a total of 27 jumps in the Army. And by that time knew I'm kind of reaching the end of my service. And really appreciated being part of a very small, connected community within the PSYOP community. And so some of the people that I had gone to basic training with, that I had trained to become a 37 Foxtrot, to then be assigned with at a couple different companies within one psychological operations group, that I had served, you know, my entire career with. And guys, you know, who were roommates, you know, were still people that I would see, if not every day, at least once a week. We'd go to lunch. We'd go to, you know, people's birthday parties, wedding receptions by this stage. So for me, the Army was very small in one aspect, because I got to see the same people time after time. I had such a different experience from someone who would have gone into a very large infantry battalion or an armored regiment. And maybe you only see people like in a small platoon for a small portion of your career. And I'm further fortunate in that many of the people that I serve with, I'm still in very good, frequent contact with. And I'm very thankful for being able to serve alongside them and have them connected and looking out for me, and you know, checking on me if I needed something, you know, reading a resume, or when my friend Paul called and said, "Hey, the State Department's hiring people for federal agent positions." Like, really? And he and I both went on to serve for more than 20 years in that agency. So we're still part of that same almost platoon size connection that we had, that I walked into way back in the summer of '89.
So looking back at all your time deployed, is there any moment that stands out the most, good or bad? Sad.
I was so fortunate to see so many different things. You know, in the third week of December, I tend to think about, you know, being an unproven, unknowing PFC about to step out of a C-141 at 500 feet above Panama. I'll see a date on a calendar and think like, yeah, this was that time when we were, you know, in Desert Storm or Desert Shield. Looking at a picture, I can kind of remember sometimes like, ooh, that was soon after, like we found a way to go into town and have something to eat, or thankfully growing, you know, now living in the United States and being retired from my federal service, I don't have to see or smell blown up bad things. But, you know, if you get the right scent of burning plastic, it might take me back to, you know, a smell that I would have encountered in Iraq. I tend to think more about the people than what I was going through. For some reason, the other day I was thinking, this is a back pain that reminds me of sitting in a Humvee for a day or two without really moving. And thinking, but I can get out. I can go for a walk around my neighborhood. So it's those experiences, it's those sights, sounds, smells, feeling that might take you back. And you know, to have mostly fond memories of all of it, even at times when it was challenging, even if you realize that's artillery impact and that's very close and that's a very bad thing, but then to not have had an impact, you know, on me. I don't have a lot of bad memories of it, and for that I'm exceedingly fortunate and thankful for that.
Yeah. What is one thing somebody might watch this video years down the road you'd like them to know about your service?
One tiny little person who spent just under 8 years, I think it was 7 years, 10 months, and some number of days, as part of a greater effort. That when our country called and needed us to go do something, that we did it, following in the footsteps of my father and my uncle, my grandfathers, great-grandfathers. Fortunate that I was able to go do that and meet the needs of our country at the time. And for my own personal experience, you know, being exposed to things that I never would have thought. Jumping out of an airplane, flying in a Marine helicopter. I was an Army sergeant. Why am I in a Marine helicopter? Being able to be part of an instruction team, being part of a development team as we tried to think about what the next generation of loudspeakers would be like. I don't think I knew it at the time, but the mindset that I had in my federal career was make something better than I found it, and not just cleaning up the office. And it doesn't have to have my imprint on it, but that something far after my time has gone, someone's going to be able to utilize something better, easier, faster, more efficiently than what we had during my time. So I can actually point to a loudspeaker system that's now hanging up in what was my old unit's headquarters, and know that I helped design that. And it then led to a further design of a loudspeaker system. And I don't know anything about electrical engineering. I don't understand the dynamics of sound being broadcast, but talking to an engineer one day with literally a piece of paper and a pen, and saying, what if we put the speakers in a fuel pod and hung that off the side of a Blackhawk? And they did it. So that was kind of cool to see that. And having had the experience of walking into that headquarters with my sons, and they don't fully understand, you did what now? But to know that if they see some of the pictures that I have from my service, if they have a little personal pride in what I did, if they show future generations, you know, here's what was happening, that's also pretty neat.
Yeah. Last question. Somebody might watch this video who's considering military service. What advice would you give them?
Unlike me, it's better to know what you're going into. Sometimes I think I had really just tremendous fool's luck, because I think I can remember sitting in the recruiter's office and seeing that video of a Jeep with a loudspeaker mount on it, and had no clue that would be my career for 8 years. I had no idea what I was getting into. Airborne option, I don't think I thought once about, I'm going to be falling out of a plane with a parachute on my back. Maybe it was just dumb, stupid luck that got me from point A to point B. But I've tried to steer some people, like, you might want to look into that, and also understanding that the military is not everything to everybody.
Yeah.
And so my what I consider an amazing military experience, someone may have a completely different experience. They may not have any of the niceties that I had. They may not have the collegiality with others that I had. They may not connect with people after they get out of the Army or the military. So It's with a balanced measure when I talk to people about. I want them to understand. Like I really think I had a fantastic time, but sometimes I think I'm a little bit of an outlier. It is what you put into it, and if you know more going into it, then maybe something that seems as if it's a setback, a challenge, a problem. If that helps you grow after that, then maybe it's not something that's insurmountable, that's not damaging. But I do feel very fortunate for what I got to experience.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, sir, for sitting down and talking to us. We really appreciate it. And most importantly, and I know this always sounds cliche, but thank you for your service.
Appreciate it.
Appreciate it.